welcome. My name's Laura Spalding. I lead our customer experience team at PERSUIT. Welcome to our webinar today on the future of e-billing. So if you're joining us, you are probably familiar with e-billing. It's probably something that might be a bit of a pain point or a friction point for you. I think e-billing was introduced in the late 90s and early 2000s. Is it offensive if I say e-billing is vintage technology? So there's a bit changing. For most legal ops teams, e-billing has them in the reactive rather than the strategic. I've got two people joining me at the center of a transformation around e-billing. I want to introduce Dominic Aelberry. He's our CRO at PERSUIT and was the CEO of PERSUIT, which we just acquired. And I've got Duncan Williams. He's the EMEA General Counsel at Westinghouse. Thank you both for joining today. Westinghouse is going through an e-billing transformation of their own. They just started with PERSUIT in April of this year. They have WIP, so work in progress, real-time visibility into spend, and the e-billing functionality. I might just kick off with you, Dom. I'm curious, you work with legal operations leaders all over the world and have done for some time. What do you hear from legal ops leaders is their biggest friction point or frustration with e-billing today?
Thanks, Laura. And first off, thanks, Duncan, for joining us. I'm super excited to be on this webinar. So great question. I think the big frustrations that I hear are that they're spending too much time using the tool for what can be seen as quite administrative types of tasks. So if we think about invoice reviews, approvals, the traditional e-billing tasks can be kind of seen as quite administrative. So that's kind of taking time away from giving the opportunity to use this data and elevate the conversation they're having internally and externally to be more about value. So yeah, we are unfortunate, I guess, that e-billing is often seen as a bit of an admin function rather than this source of strategic spend data, which can be leveraged to translate the value of the legal department to the business.
Duncan, does that resonate? How are you thinking about e-billing before you brought in PERSUIT? What was your team facing a challenge?
Yeah, that's right. We were doing tasks. We were paying invoices. We weren't analyzing data. Just getting the data together was very difficult. You had to pull it from SAP and from the e-billing platform and then try to aggregate it. It came out in a format that was very difficult to work with. And now you're actually able to, in a couple of clicks, look at the overview of your legal spend. It's a revolution. It's a completely different step. I actually almost preferred the previous, 15 years ago when we were entering all our invoices into a spreadsheet. Frankly, that was probably easier than trying to aggregate your data from a bunch of different sources.
Yeah. I'm curious for the attendees on the webinar today, I might jump into a quick poll. Curious, how are you handling invoice review today within your legal teams? Is it something that you're still doing entirely manual? I know in my experience, not every client that we have has e-billing. Not everyone that we've worked with has even adopted a centralized e-billing function. Are you semi-automated? Are you using e-billing tools, but maybe you're still doing a lot of manual review, like negotiating line items, poring over timesheets? Are you going through and spending a lot of time flagging errors and going back and forth with firms on their entries? What is your approach today? I'll give that a second or two to see where we're going. Results are. Okay, all right, I can see the results come through here. So as I suspected, most of you are semi-automated. So you are using e-billing functionality today, but you're still finding it incredibly manual. There's a lot of the administration that Dom just described, and you're not necessarily getting the value from that centralization of data. So I want to talk just a little bit more about why e-billing is broken before we get into what's changing and what the future looks like. So it's been around for over 20 years. Why do so many teams feel stuck? Dom, I might ask you, what are the struggle points? Why is it broken structurally, behaviorally? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I haven't been doing e-billing for 20 years, just in case that was a question. But I think, yeah, I think in some respects, e-billing in its original form delivered on some of the promise, automation, checking invoices, workflow and those kind of improvements. I think where it's failed to evolve or improve is the perception, the process, the underlying process, and the perception of it being an administrative kind of tool operation. It's quite funny to think 20 years of e-billing, even with all of the evolution of AI that we've gone through really rapidly recently, a traditional approach to e-billing is still focused around the invoice, which obviously we receive after the work is done. And if we think about that objectively, it's kind of too late, right? We're receiving the data that's really valuable to us after we've done the work, after the work's been done. So we really believe that we should be setting our outside counsel up for success at the very beginning, scoping the work clearly, and then we can look at that work whilst it's taking place in order to get that data and move that whole process across to the left, so we're having different conversations whilst work's taking place, rather than waiting for this invoice, which is what historically billing is focused around.
And what do you think is stopping clients from focusing more on the invoice or the work as it's being performed and the entries as they're being entered? And why do you think there's such a burden on the buyer of the legal services versus the firm?
Well, great questions. So first of all, is a technology capability requirement, right? You need to have a system that provides you continuous WIP or accruals data. So there's definitely that. Having the ability to share your billing rules with your vendors also requires some technology to do that. I think there's then the underlying fact that we talked about is that this process, this way of working has been around for 20 years. So there's a lot of inertia around that. It's the way we've done it always, and it takes a while to come out of those really established processes. I also think there's a control thing. If we want to start moving away from looking at every line item and pressing that button that says that it feels quite tangible. So there's a trust thing to let go of that, which we have to get used to as well.
Yeah. Duncan, does that sound familiar to you? What did it look like for you in 12 months before Aperio or even earlier in your career?
Well, I'd say the big thing, and like Dom said, the big change is access to the WIP, the access to firms' accounting systems. That's really e-billing, right? Before you might as well just gotten a letter in the mail, all the changes, you didn't have to scan it in, right? The big changes, I don't know if all law firms work this way, but most do, is they can write time off when it's in the WIP, right? But once they've issued the invoice, if a partner writes down the invoice, it hits his personal P&L, right? And so they take actual pain. They actually have to take a loss in their personal, P&L statement within the firm. So that hurts their bottom line. That hurts their payment at the end of the year. But they can write it off before they issue the invoice. And so now you have access to that stage of the process. Some firms do that, if they have a good relationship with their client, but many do not. Most do not. They just try to force your hand by sending you the invoice, and then it's hard to negotiate.
Yeah. With the exception of time, what do you think is the impact on focus or strategy? What do you wish that your teams were spending more time doing that perhaps they were stuck before doing in invoice review?
Well, before they had to manually check compliance with agreed rates, right? The systems weren't set up to actually track that directly. Sometimes they do, sometimes they didn't. And then the system would flag all kinds of useless information, as opposed to stuff you really care about. So that's a huge advantage, because then now we can focus on the ledger, the description of the work that's being done. We can also track partner time versus associate time, right? And we can put a cap on that. And that's very powerful. These are very powerful tools to control legal spend.
Just before we get into what you've seen since you started looking at the WIP, I'm curious to understand, maybe from both of you, what are we talking about when we're talking about looking at real-time spend visibility? Can we break it down a bit for people who haven't seen the technology?
Dom, go ahead. Do you want to describe it? You probably have a better version than I do.
Very, very happy to. So yeah, so with the Aperis system, you get access to real-time, live, continuous data direct from the practice management system. So you can see that down to the line item, and that enables you to unlock a different way of taking decisions on that data. So it can be used in all sorts of ways. I'm sure Duncan will share what he does in his business, but all sorts of ways to move that conversation to the left of the process. So we can dive in and see perhaps if there's fee earner stacking on a matter. Sometimes we might be happy with it, but sometimes we might want to question it. So really being able to get much more proactive into work as it's taking place just elevates that conversation. Really our objective, what we try to do is take some of that friction out of the process that can be there if you're just focused around the invoice and then checking work that's already been done.
So Duncan, you're still pretty early in the process. What were the first signs of tangible impact that you saw?
Well, before, it took us, I'd say 2 or 3 months, like I said, to extract all the data and figure out what we were spending our money on. The biggest sections of our legal spend by labor and employment, corporate law, litigation, that kind of thing. Here you've got it, you snap your fingers and you've got it in one click. Your spend by firm is much easier to break down. You can isolate your top 3 firms, 4 firms, 10 firms, break it down however you want and see how you're spending your money. And for us, the immediate revelation was the amount of partner time, the percentage of partner time on our matters. And then you can go into the ledger and see the description of the work that's being done. And you could say, well, is this really partner time? And, could this be, should this be done by associates? And then if you, cap that, if you say, I don't want more than 20 or 25% partner time on my matters, the system allows you to police it and then disincentivizes the firms to stack. Like Dom was saying, you get conference calls with 3 partners on them. What's the purpose? They don't need all 3 of them billing, for an hour on a conference call in many cases. So we're able to spot that immediately and cut it off. And I would also say one other thing is budgets. You set your budget and then you can see in real time where you are with your budget. You can see where you are in billed and unbilled. And so you can see when your unbilled portion starts to approach your budget for a matter, and then you can have that conversation immediately before it gets billed, before you hit your budget, And again, you can look at the ledger and you can see what the work that's done and by whom that's getting you up to the top, up to your budget number. So.
And so are you at the point yet where you're having conversations like that with your firms?
Oh, definitely.
Talk to them about, what do some of those conversations look like? What's come out of that, just in terms of immediate impact on invoices or bill time?
Yeah. Be able to see matters where it's 100% partner time.
Yeah.
And say, look, this is, that's not appropriate. Or look at matters where you've got, 8 or 10 people calling the law firm, maybe asking the same questions at the same time, in different cases. And so that allows you to say, hey, we need to, because you can see that in the ledger, spoke with so-and-so, spoke with this other person. And you can say, okay, we need to speak with one voice. Questions, on this topic need to be channeled through one in-house person to go to the law firm. right? Or, 2 or 3, whatever, but you can't have 10 people calling the partner asking the same questions.
Yeah. Dom, when you've seen other clients go through this process, what kind of changes do you see them implement when they start to actually see the data, get visibility into how they're working with their firms? What helps them to change the way that they operate? What are some of the first things that they do in response to access to that data and visibility?
Yeah, I mean, just a ton of things, right? Very transformational. I mean, the first thing is you're spending less time on invoice review, right? So that's really helpful. And as Duncan mentions, it can just change the way that you're kind of working with your law firms, much more about partnership. Of course, better data makes everyone look like they're more in control, more professional, which is super helpful internally as well. But yeah, a lot of really transformational relationship improvements that you can see from working closer and further to the left of the process.
Yeah. And does it change some of the behaviors in the lawyers, the attorneys that you're working with, so far as how they view their firm relationships and their ownership of their own spend?
Yeah, so do we see it in the platform? Absolutely. Yeah. So we see an improvement over time. We see closer relationships. Yeah, it's really an overall positive for both sides by using this data, discussing things proactively, spending less time on admin through more automation, and really, driving a better level of conversation.
Yeah. Just saw a question in the chat, just on the back of that, Dom, that I'm curious about. It's a good one. We hear a lot about closer relationships, better law firm relationships, stronger firm relationships. What does that actually mean to you? And Duncan, I might ask you the same question after that.
Yeah, just very briefly from me, it means working more closely together and talking about value rather than the traditionally billing path, which is to talk about line item disagreements on an invoice of work that's already been done. So by opening up this new window that we can open up on the data, we can build conversations about value. We can have more proactive discussions if a matter is perhaps going off track. We can get to it earlier so it doesn't become a problem when the invoices crystallize that spend and we have to get into toing and froing or a disagreement, unfortunately. So yeah, that's what I mean. It's really about taking friction out by having more proactive conversations and using that to talk about value. So that's what I see.
Shifting the relationship from cost at the invoice stage to value as the work's being performed.
100%.
And is that something that you're observing the early signs of, Duncan, after the shift to real-time visibility?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can create, what I like about this system is you can create an aggregate of all the firms, let's say, working on a topic, right? Maybe you got a few different firms working on similar types of projects for a business line. You can aggregate the cost of all those instantly and see it at once. And like Dom said, you can have that conversation about my legal fees should not exceed X% of the value of my business, right? And you can have that conversation on a real-time basis instead of waiting at the end of the year, right? You can explain to these people, this is how much, this is my target EBITDA or my target revenue for this business line. I cannot support more than X in legal fees, for that amount of business, or on a specific transaction, a financing or an M&A deal. And you can say, this is what we need to achieve. And it's win-win, it's a win for me. And it's also a win for you because we're going to want to continue working with you. And then it's also, them not charging you for all those orchids that they put in their offices, right? That's the other part. Yeah, that's just a joke. That drives so many people crazy when they go to law firms' offices and they see how fancy they are, and you realize you're paying for it. But anyway, that's another story.
I won't comment on that, but only because I used to be a lawyer and I agree. I'm curious, we're talking about the law firm relationships, and I just had a thought that this probably drastically improves your relationship with finance and your internal business relationships when you can actually start to talk about legal as a cost center, but actually report on how you're making changes, transformative changes that help you better control some of your spend and get that insight. How have some of those early conversations been with your finance team or even your C-suite?
It makes you look serious. It makes you look like you're actually doing something about it. And when you can present hard figures every week or every month or every quarter, and they're reliable and they're instantaneous and they're presented, nicely without having somebody having to spend, weeks and weeks putting it all together. It makes you look like you're really part of the team and you're not just a cost center. This gets back to, I don't want to ignore Scott's question. He asked a question earlier about, why aren't we demanding process to be changed? I think this is, because lawyers are terrible at technology. Let's be honest with ourselves. At least we're always a step behind. We're always a step behind the other functions. We may be pretty good at it, but we're always a little bit behind. And we're necessarily a little bit conservative. So I think people hesitate to adopt a system like this. But when you do, again, you're sort of playing on the same field with the finance team and other teams. You look more serious.
Yeah, I think one thing we observe also is that lawyers are so focused on driving legal outcomes that they don't necessarily view their role as managing spend as buyers and procurement professionals. And so there is some element of changing the behaviors and the culture within the legal department to think of spend as something that you have a responsibility to manage, report on, and be efficient with. So I might segue us into some of the more behavioral or cultural challenges. I know any transformation has its hurdles and its roadblocks. Duncan, what was some of the earlier challenges when you started to roll out this visibility? What did you observe, and how did you overcome those?
People hate change.
Yeah.
They don't want to try a new system, even if it's better, even if it's much easier. Overcoming that, I think explaining the why, getting people to buy in early, that's a cliche now, but, showing people the value of the data, kind of before you start to change, I think that makes a big difference. The people who tested the system before we adopted were just blown away. They loved it. And then the people who didn't understand why we were doing it. So that's one important factor. The other thing, our accounting system is giving us grief about internal budget codes with entity codes and this kind of stuff. Has nothing to do with the e-billing system, right? It's a pure accounting problem. But people kind of associate it with the system when it has nothing to do with the system. So overcoming that, I think getting our accounting ducks in a row is an important part of it. And then I discovered one thing, that a lot of big international firms are not really partnerships. They're like franchises, and so they won't bill with the same legal entity. And so you get these whole raft, you get a look under the hood where you see that, these firms, they're not really sharing profits and revenue. They're like, every matter that's split between London and and Madrid is the object of a negotiation between those two legal entities, even though they've got the same name on the door. So that's been revelatory, I think, with this process.
I'm curious about the early adopters that you mentioned, the people that helped champion the change. Who, you don't have to name them, but were they lawyers? Were they e-billing professionals, legal operations? Who were those people, and how do you kind of come to get people like that to want to trial or engage in change like this?
Gosh, it was procurement.
Right.
It was procurement. They got to start getting involved, like you said, professionalizing our legal purchasing, right? Treating us as a category of spend, as opposed to, some kind of critical strategic function where we didn't care how much we were spending.
Yeah.
And they got involved and they tried to get our data and they couldn't do it. And it was a mess. And then we got legal ops involved and they said, no, we're not changing. No, we don't have time to change. We're too busy. And I said, just take a look. Just take a look. Do the demo. And they did, and they're like, oh my goodness, this is so much. This is a new world. So yeah, it was procurement, and we had to convince legal ops. And once we did that, everybody else followed suit, really.
And I'm just curious, not sure if we touched on this before, but was this new e-billing or a change in e-billing providers from a previous provider?
Change. It was a change.
Okay.
And again, like our previous e-billing provider was an invoice management service.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're in a data analysis, right? It pays invoices, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the main point. It's the aggregation and analysis of data that allows you to, that just is a radical change from our previous technology.
Yeah.
And so Scott asked a question about that. I would try to deal with questions as they.
No, you go for it.
But that's absolutely right. This has changed the way we scope and budget.
Yeah.
We're now forcing firms to enter a budget when they enter a matter, right, in the system. And so, kind of like saying it's automatic. When we say you can't create a new matter in the billing system unless you put a budget, right? And then as far as scoping, again, you try to circumscribe, right? We're not paying for first-year associates, for example. No more than 25% partner time. My volume discounts, once I reach X number of dollars in billings with your firm, I want another, 5% on top of my 20% discount. And this allows you to police that instantly without having to, wait to the end of the quarter or wait for the, final invoice to arrive.
Yeah. I know you mentioned some of the fee arrangements that you have. In a prep call, you talked about how there might have been a perception before that you had these really great competitive rates because you had these blended rates that you had negotiated, and being able to get this visibility into partner time by jurisdiction and actually on the matters helped you see where you actually were competitive, but where you weren't in terms of the rates that you had negotiated.
Yeah. It's funny. I joined and I saw it because I'm from the US, but I've been in Europe for 20 years. So I know the market here, maybe more up close than people do in the US. And they thought they were getting a great deal because they averaged the price of partners and associates in London with lawyers on the continent. And in fact, I saw immediately we were paying more in Paris and Berlin than what you would pay for them if you just went and knocked on the door of the Paris office, right? And so fortunately, we caught it that way. But I think there's other technology out there that I've seen demoed where you actually can have access to like market practices or average rates for different jurisdictions, so you can actually automate that knowledge, right?
Yeah. This isn't about PERSUIT, but PERSUIT. That's
you get yeah. It is powerful. And I'll just say I've seen this. I won't name any names, but I have seen it inside firms where they're let's say their billing rate's $1,000 an hour, and they'll do a pitch to the client, a potential client, and they'll say, well, our normal billing rate's $1,200, but for you, we'll give you a 20% discount down to $1,000, right? And all they're doing is really just giving you the rate that they charge anyway, but they're pretending like it's a discount. So, these systems where you can have access to, what's the going market rate, I think has a lot of value.
Dom, I just wanted to go back to you on the point about change in legal departments. I think we've established change is difficult in bringing in any new technology, but I think you'll know from experience that changing from one provider, particularly in e-billing, over to a new provider is a new challenge in and of itself. These legacy e-billing softwares are so sticky. They're these big monsters and they're really hard to shift from. In your experience, what have you seen be successful for teams that you've seen actually change e-billing providers over, and what's helped them push through the resistance?
Yeah, great question. I agree with everything that Duncan said, by the way. some of the lessons that we've learned are really to focus on that value, like get to value first, race towards the value, because that then gives us something to celebrate, right? You can build your champions from there. So don't get fixated on perfection, because you get paralyzed by perfection. You know, in our case, when we're opening up this window to the practice management system, we also get historic data, so you can get a ton of value really, really quickly, which gives us something to celebrate. Could also overcome skeptics, right, by getting those early wins. And the other thing that we know, I think we all know this one is important, is executive engagement throughout the process. So an exec champion at the start, executive engagement throughout, and you know, if we can get a nice early win, giving that to the execs to celebrate as well, because they probably had to sign it off, is also a really, really huge thing. So yeah, that's the things that I'd add to what Duncan said. Yeah, focus value quick, get to value quickly, celebrate, build your champions.
Yeah. And with the kind of visibility that you can get, that quick win can come very quickly when you get that first visibility, even if it's just in one use case, one matter, to be able to go back and show the business that you've got this oversight and how you might scale that across all of your spend, is a really great way to get that executive endorsement.
Absolutely, yeah. Super quick to get it. We'll typically get 3 years of historic data, look at trends on that immediately. So you can build a real nice trend analysis and gets deep on that data really, really quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got one more question for you, Duncan, but just before I ask it, we're going to jump into questions shortly. So if everybody wants to start putting any questions that they have in the chat, or I think there's a Q&A functionality as well, you can drop them in there. We will get to those shortly. Duncan, any advice to teams that are about to go through this journey of implementing this WIP visibility or new e-billing system? What would you say would make them successful?
Well, I would give one piece of advice, and I don't know if this is the case in the US, but this is getting to be market practice in the US, is to charge the cost of your e-billing service back to your firms, right? Make them issue a credit note. You do a pro rata, annual pro rata of your spend, and then charge that percentage to the firm, make them issue a credit note for that. So make the firms pay for the system. It's like, making somebody pay for the stick that you beat them with, which is poetic justice in a way. So I do quite enjoy that. But we got that upset face, I think. Sorry.
Yeah, I saw that. I don't know where that came from, but
maybe that's too mean, too harsh, the metaphor.
I love it.
Okay, good. Thank you. I was afraid I was upsetting somebody's sensibilities. But yeah, explain to people the value. Have as many people as possible do the demo so they see what they can do with it, and then just get people, like, do training sessions almost weekly, or if not bi-weekly, with different teams, and just get them clicking into it, get them clicking through the system, and then get them to look at the WIP once a week on their matters. I would say the only, the thing you really need is buy-in from the people, because you can't have one person looking at all the WIPs, right? Because, that centralized person, even if it's the CLO, isn't going to be able to know. They're going to be too far from the matter. So it's the in-house attorneys who are working on the matter who need to look at the WIP. And if you get the right people doing it, and they do it once a week, and they do it for 10 minutes, you can really get out in front of stuff and start to show the firms that you're not gonna just let them railroad you. Let's put it that way. So that's really the key, is getting everybody in the organization to use it on a regular basis. There's a few key people who have to really master it and look at the overall picture, but individuals need to be looking at their matters too.
Okay, I've got Scott with the great questions in the chat again. Scott's curious about the requirements in the use of AFAs. Has the use of technology changed the requirements in the use of AFAs? I don't know if you've got an opinion on that pretty broad question. Has this technology changed the way you think about using AFAs within the legal department? Has it become more of a requirement, if I'm interpreting the question?
Absolutely, because you can see it, and you could check it, and you don't have to wait, for a month after the fact. I mean, because you can see the WIP, you can see how close you're getting. I don't know, if anybody still bills like the old-fashioned way where you used to, send a bill at the end of a matter. Let's say if you're doing a big bank debt deal and it took 6 months, it used to be the firms would bill at the end of that. Like when you did your drawdown, right? Like until the client gets their money, the law firm doesn't get paid. This will allow you to see that, see what's happening throughout the engagement, throughout that long period. A big M&A deal, same thing, you can tell what and how much they're doing every week. And so you could negotiate an AFA in the middle of the year, right? If you get to the 6-month period and you say, wait a minute, we're spending way more with you guys than we thought we are. We're going to bust through the top threshold in our volume discount ladder. We need to add another one because we're doing so much business.
Yeah. Dom, what are you seeing in terms of how Aperio customers are using real-time visibility to better manage alternative fee arrangements, and perhaps alternative fee arrangements that aren't time-based?
Yeah, I think I love Duncan's example there of, using this unique data to enable us to make better decisions. And that can be at the front of the process, looking at, vendor selection or creating an AFA at the start, or as Duncan says, somewhere further down the line. So where does the other use cases we see for using the WIP data, one is around, seeing resource and therefore cost associated with it, but also scope. So can we see what's happening on scope and if there's any material deviation, for example? So those are the kind of two areas that I see WIP data being used around AFAs. I think the ultimate position is that we actually use the WIP data to make those decisions at the start of the process, or identifying opportunities to look at bringing AFAs in further down a piece of work.
Yeah, I know that's an interesting point about deviation in the scope of work. I know there's a perception that it's impossible to control or predict cost in legal because you can't predict the life of a matter and where it will go. So being able to actually maintain a conversation with your firms about the scope as it evolves throughout the life of the matter and the cost relative to that scope is empowering teams to maintain that predictability and control, but also make sure that they don't get to the end of the matter and they're just at the mercy of the time spent. Like, sorry, this matter went left. We didn't anticipate it. And we just started billing our maximum partner rate against all of this work. Here's the invoice.
Can I share a story? This reminds me what Dom just said. When my first year, I was at a big law firm in New York, and I was a corporate associate doing M&A mostly, and I get sent to the library for like 3 months to write this huge memo about all the different theories, the legal theories we could use to sue somebody, a client. So I spent all these late nights reading the restatement of torts, and it was totally useless to the client. I mean, totally useless. And they had another firm doing the litigation aspects, right? And if we'd had the access to the WIP, the client had access to the WIP, they could have cut that off immediately. They would have been able to, we don't need this research. Forget this. Stop this right now. We don't even want to read this memo, right? Happens all the time. Firms look for excuses to bill. And like Dom said, the scope creep, you can stop that immediately.
Yeah. It's a story I feel like I've heard before as well.
You might have lived it. Yeah.
Might have lived it. We have a couple more minutes. I don't know if anybody has any remaining questions for Dom or Duncan before we wrap up. I'll give it. Oh, I've got a couple here. All right, Jill, has there been any pushback from firms regarding access to their work in progress data?
Did I take that? So the firms get a lot of value from automating the collection and I guess publication of their WIP. So they're very keen to get rid of that manual work. It also changes the relationship with, as we've gone through extensively on this webinar. So we don't get pushback. We find that the law firms enjoy being closer to their customers.
Duncan,
I had one firm out of 60 maybe, who asked to opt out of it, and it was a firm that had done work for us in the past on specific matters in a specific jurisdiction, and that it was unlikely we were going to do much work with them going forward. So we had like a little time on the clock this year, maybe very, very little. And they said, look, this is, more trouble than it's worth. We'd like to opt out. So yeah, 1 out of 60, and they said it's not worth it for 20 grand or something. So that was the only pushback I got on the WIP.
Yeah, it's one of those things that comes with time as the market shifts towards this normalization of visibility. There is always some resistance from firms. I know I experienced it with PERSUIT years ago as well, but now it's really it's the buyers making the change with the technology and the expectations. And so I'm sure this kind of WIP visibility will follow that same story.
Yeah. There's certainly a kind of appropriateness, like you're saying, Duncan. Like if you're only going to work on one matter or a few matters, it's not appropriate to ask for WIP.
Yeah, it's not necessary.
Yeah.
Scott asked, why can't we ask firms to create an upfront bottom-up budget and manage them against it, holding them accountable for any deviations? I know a lot of clients do that. They start with that and they scope out the matter in the 4 different trajectories that it could go, and they ask the client to give them phase-based fixed fees for each of the cost-driving activities within each phase, and they put the onus on the firm to communicate with the client about the deviations. I imagine that with the onus already on the firm, this kind of WIP visibility is actually helpful for the firms. It creates efficiencies in their process of managing deviations with their own clients. Any thoughts on that, Duncan or Dom?
Yeah, Don, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna see if you had it probably at a level of detail that I'm not at, but yeah, it sounds like a perfect use case for PERSUIT, frankly.
Yeah.
How do we help get that? How do we help our outside counsel scope correctly? And that's something that we're really trying to work hard on working on, because that's in many respects the secret to all of this partnership working really well. So yeah, I mean, Scott, from a technology perspective, yeah, we can do all of that, absolutely. Then we have to work on changing the proactive nature of our relationship and our conversation, so we are actually managing it together, and it doesn't feel like we're over managing it, over aggressively or anything like that. It's important to come to it with the right tone, the right approach.
Yeah, we still shoot for like a percentage, the value of the transaction or business, whatever.
Yeah.
I know we're at time. I just want to ask one more question, probably to you, Dom. I know there's a variation in customers in terms of how many firms they currently have connected to the WIP visibility as well as the e-billing. Most clients start with their top spend firms or their panel firms. But do you have a sense of the average number of firms that clients have connected to?
Yeah, so we try and capture all spend.
Yeah.
So it typically kind of follows the 80-20 rule in terms of WIP. So you want that continuous data feed from your most, so from the 20% of your firms that you spend 80% of your spend with. So it typically follows that kind of ratio. And we're, doing more and more with our customers to make that even a greater share. But that's the typical way we look at it.
Well, thank you both for joining today. Thank you, Duncan, for sharing with us the inner workings of your department and how you've seen success with the visibility and the e-billing. And thank you, Dom, for sharing a perspective across all of our customers. I might leave it there, and we will share the recording of this to everyone that registered afterwards.